Um, but thank you again, everybody, for joining us here this afternoon for the 2021 PA UCC Residential Code Update Part 1. This has been approved for AIA, LUHSW. Here's the description that we're just going to quickly talk about some of the changes that are going to be included in the new code update. But more importantly, we're going to start today's presentation off with how the codes are adopted and some very important dates that we're all going to be looking forward to. Looking at a couple learning objectives here, we're going to review the overall PA-UCC or Uniform Construction Code update process. We're going to take a look at the process, a look at that timeline, but we're not going to get into great detail. I just think it's important that everybody understands how do we get from the 2018 code to the 2021 codes? What's the process that happens, and when does that take it into effect? And then we're going to look at three main or significant changes that's going to be included in those updates. So fundamentally, just starting off, we're going to answer these questions as we go through today's presentation. But what is the PAUCC? What's changing? That's why you're here today, right? You want to know what's changing and when is it changing? And then most importantly that I think is where do I go for more information? Darren, myself, and the rest of the PHRC team, we're going to provide throughout this code adoption process multiple webinars, multiple speaking engagements, but we are not going to be able to cover everything. So not only is it important for us to provide you with some of those key changes that are going to take place, but sometimes more importantly, you need to know where you can go to find out this information. Maybe you're doing a project and you're like, I remember one of those folks from PHRC talking a little bit about this. Let me now go to my resources and find out some additional information because we obviously wouldn't expect everybody to remember everything that we say. So first and foremost here, what is the PAUCC or the Pennsylvania Uniform Construction Code? And that's the Pennsylvania statewide building code. I know we've gone through quite a few updates as I've been here with the PHRC, and we often get some comments coming back, the uniform code in Pennsylvania, the statewide building code, and there is one, right? There is a spot that everybody must go or should go to find out what that overarching building code is within Pennsylvania. Some municipalities will have certain amendments or different items that they adopted locally. There are some requirements to make that relevant, so we have to know that. We're not going to get into that here today, but it's important to know that there is an overarching one uniform construction code in Pennsylvania that we all have to start from. How do these PAUCC, how does the PAUCC relate to the ICC or International Codes Council family of codes? The PAUCC administration and enforcement regulations adopt the ICC codes on a triennial basis. If you think way back, that wasn't the case. The codes were sometimes adopted, sometimes not adopted, but Act 36 of 2017 here in Pennsylvania formally set into place an adoption process for building codes. Now, this happens, I'll get into what that timeline may look like, but that is set into motion so that every 3 years, plus or minus a couple months, Pennsylvania does review the latest triennial, not the latest, but the newest to Pennsylvania triennial-based codes from ICC. Previously, or at least now, the codes that we're currently under were adopted in February 14th, happy Valentine's Day, right? 2022. And they were the 2018 codes with amendments, right? And as we go through this, we'll figure out what that means when I talk about with amendments. So speaking of that, here we are, right? Are the ICC codes adopted word for word, or are amendments allowed? If you remember going back to the 2018 adoption, there are amendments. So it's important to also know that there are two types of amendments. There are statutory amendments, and then there are amendments by the PAUCC Review and Advisory Council, or the RAC. They both are amendments to the written code in the ICC code book, right? If you're looking at for residential, if we look at the IRC, these amendments are amending the language that's written in those code books. However, the statutory amendments and the amendments by the Review and Advisory Council, or the RAC, carry with it two different meanings. And We'll get into that here in a little bit. But first of all, this is a quick review of the code adoption process. This is in particular for the 2021 code adoption process. As you can see here at the top, and I'm not going to go through all of this, this is for your reference only, but at the top here, in January 31st, 2021, ICC officially published the 2021 ICC Family of Codes. That published date is what officially kicks the PA-UCC Review and Advisory Council into gear, and the timeline starts from that moment to ultimately get us to what you have down here at the bottom, the one in red, which is the July 13th, 2025 go live date, right? So all of the stuff that happens here in the middle of, January 31st, 21 and July 13th, 2025, all have to do or are all based on a timeline specified in legislation. And, the RAC has to have 3 public hearings, both east or all, one in the east, one in the west, and one in central Pennsylvania, so on and so forth. But this is all laid out, again, starting from the published date of those codes. Looking really quick, I have 2 slides dedicated to the Industrialized Housing Act. This first one here just shows that DCED under Section 5 of the Industrialized Housing Act is authorized to promulgate rules and regulations to interpret and make specific provisions of the act to assure the health, safety, and welfare of the people of this Commonwealth by requiring safe and sanitary industrialized housing. This really just says that DCED has the authority to take a look at the adopted codes and then apply those through the Industrialized Housing Act. This here, it talks about the base code. I'm sure you've probably heard the PHRC at one point in time refer to the ICC codes as the base code. And the reason for that is this is the ultimate starting point. So when the Review and Advisory Council, or the RAC, we're just going to call it from the RAC from now on, when they do the code review process, they look at the IRC, for instance, that's what we're going to talk about here today, and then they make determinations on the written code here on what they may adopt, not adopt, or modify moving forward. Therefore, that makes the IRC the base code in which everything from there starts. As the RAC reviews it, they can modify some of the language, and we'll talk about a little bit of that here later on. But this is the starting point, or the base code. So we're going from the current base code, which is the 2018 IRC, to the new up and coming base code, which will be the 2021 IRC. I just wish we could have one book, but that's not how it works here in Pennsylvania. So we have our base code, and then we have to sprinkle in our statutory amendments, which are legislatively adopted, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. And then you have to sprinkle in the RAC amendments. So to have a full comprehensive view of the building codes in Pennsylvania, these are the 3 main starting points, or the 3 main publications that you have to go to get the most holistic view of what the building codes are here in Pennsylvania. So it starts off with our base code, right? And then you have to look at, well, what statutory amendments are out there, and then look at what RAC amendments are out there, and then you can compile that all together, and that gives you a really good understanding of the current building codes that we have to abide by here in Pennsylvania. So what are statutory amendments? They are amendments that were legislatively written. So the next slide here talks about, I have a few examples of what they are. If you want the full list of the statutory amendments, you can click on this link. And I know, Rachel, thank you very much for sharing the link to the handouts. If you folks jump to the chat, you can there's an active link there to go and pull or download the handouts for today's presentation, and all of the links that I share in these slides should be active on those handouts. So feel free to download that and have that as a resource. But if you want to look at the full list of amendments, you can go there. But to kind of take a look at what the amendments are, they're legislative changes to the code, and the only way that they can change is through additional legislation. So I'll just jump to a couple examples here. If you look at Act 13 of 2004, that's the stairway tread and riser requirements. If you look at the 2000, we're currently under the 2018 IRC. If you look at the 2018 provisions for stair geometry, it is going to say 7 3/4 and 11 for the stair, riser, and tread depth. But we are not under that. That was modified through legislation, through a statutory amendment as in Act 13 of 2004, that for now and until it's changed legislatively again, we are with 8 1/4 riser and 10-inch tread for our stair geometry. That's a legislative or statutory amendment. Jumping down here to the last one is Act 1 of 2011. That was the removal of fire sprinklers out of the code, and introduced fire protection of lightweight floor systems and wall bracing. So if you're aware of the wall bracing provisions, regardless of what code we're under or what code is adopted here in Pennsylvania, our wall bracing provisions take us back to the 2006 wall bracing provisions. Okay. Regardless of what code we're under, there are more statutory amendments. You can jump to the previous slide here and go to that website for the listing of those. But again, it's important to know the difference that statutory amendments cannot and will not change unless they are legislatively changed. The second grouping of modifications are the rack amendments, and they are changing every time we have a new code adoption cycle, and the rack does the review of those code provisions. They can make those changes for any code provisions that are different from the previous code, the previous written code. So if you want to find, thank you, Tom McCosby, 8 1/4 9, for those stair geometry. If we want to look at the rack amendments, you can again either download the handouts, and this is an active link, or you can get your phone out and you can scan this QR code and it'll take you right to the rack report. Um, this report it includes, and I have a copy of it right here. I'm not going to expect anybody to read that, but it's 52 pages, I believe, is the number of pages in this rack report. And the way that it's laid out is that when reviewing it, it's not just the IRC, it's all of the ICC codes compiled into one rack report. And when looking at the text, there's some good giveaways as to what you're looking at. If it's a regular text, it's context of what the code provision is going to happen. And then if the text is italicized, that is actual written code language. If any text is underlined within this document, that is added language in addition to the written code. And if any of the language has a strikeout through it, that language has been removed. So there's a little bit of a legend when going through this rack report, and hopefully that can help you out when reviewing it. I would highly encourage everybody to, at some point, download this, some point in the near future, download this and become familiar with it, because this is really the only document out there that pulls together all of the modifications from the rack review process. So the report does, as I already mentioned, it looks at all of the UCC codes. It's not just the IRC. It has the IBC. It has the plumbing code, and it has all the codes that are in the purview of the rack reviewing, all documented, and all of the modifications are included in this rack report. The specific amendments resulting from the rack review process are included in here with the amended language that's also included. And again, I kind of ran through what that legend for how that text looks, for your convenience in looking through that report. So when is this all changing? This is a very, very important date for everyone. The anticipated effective date for the PA UCC code changes. Okay, looking at the PA UCC code summary, the energy code summary, this has an additional look to it, right, from our base code slides. And looking at the energy codes, we have the ability to look at Chapter 11 out of the IRC. We have the ability to look at the residential Chapter 4 provisions out of the IECC, and then we have to apply the rack amendments to both of those. And then we also have the Pennsylvania residential energy provisions. If you're familiar at all with the PA alt, we the PHRC publishes this alternative energy provision based on the adopted code, right? So we are currently, and when I say we have some awesome folks working hard on the modeling process for the new Pennsylvania alternative, taking a look back at the provisions out of the 2021 IRC Chapter 11 and the provisions out of the residential provisions out of the IECC with amendments, and we are currently modeling those homes, and we will be producing. It's going to be titled, don't be confused by this, but the title of the upcoming Pennsylvania alternative will be the 2025 Pennsylvania Alternative Residential Energy Provisions, because DCED requires us to name the document in which the year in which it was published. And this will be published. We are hoping to have the energy models completed by the end of 2024, which will then come internally here to the PHRC, and we will update the actual document and have that for release once the Department of Labor and Industry gives us the go-ahead after they do their review. We'll have that published and ready to be submitted early 2025. So I already answered a couple of these questions here. If you're not familiar with the Pennsylvania alternative, it is a compliance allowed by the UCC Title 34, Chapter 403. The intent of this document is that it is simpler to build and easier to enforce. It's more rational and flexible in terms of looking at that it's focused on Pennsylvania in terms of climatic and other conditions, right? So instead of looking at a code that is a lot more open to being buildable across the country, this really takes into account the focus and building practices and climatic conditions, and specifically within Pennsylvania. It is equivalent to the provisions of the IECC, right? So even though it says simpler to build, easier to enforce, more rational and flexible, it still must be equivalent to the provisions of the IECC. It is prescriptive, which versus the modeling side of things, and it allows for trade-offs. So really quickly on how this works, and this is not a PA alt training session, but I feel that it's a great opportunity to explain what the Pennsylvania alternative is. And I like to use a scale, right? So I'm going to pretend this pen here is a scale. And the PA alt has entrance requirements or energy enhancement options, right? So it might be an energy efficient heat pump or an energy efficient gas furnace that's more efficient than code. You have to choose one of those, and that tips the scale, right? We're now more efficient than the code allows or the code states. Well, then we have trade-offs. This is where the simpler to build comes in. One example of that is adding a thermal break between a slab and a foundation wall, as opposed to the required R10 insulation. That is less energy efficient. Therefore, that scale now begins to tip back to a balanced point. That's a really quick introduction of what the Pennsylvania alternative is, and we will be having some additional training on that in the upcoming future. So 2 questions here. Will the PA alt be updated? The answer to that is yes, it's currently in the process. And when will this be available? I already gave a quick introduction of that. So we are hoping to have the modeling completed by the end of 2024, which will then allow us to update the actual document at the beginning of 2025. So where do I go for more information? Here you go. Here's that QR code again for the final rack report. And then you also have the codes again are free to view online. You may not be able to copy the text out, but it is free to view. So here are again active links that you can click on through the handouts, or if you just Google search 2021 IRC codes, it should take you to a pretty good point where you can get to those codes. Okay, so now that we covered, how the codes are adopted in Pennsylvania, and how that whole adoption process occurs, and some important dates that we all have to have into consideration. Now, yes, Scott Brown, good question. Let me jump back again really quick. Yes, it is capital I, capital R, capital C. 2021, capital I, capital R, capital C, 1124. Okay, jumping back to it, now that we have everything covered from the beginning portion in regard to how the codes are adopted here in Pennsylvania, the date of implementation, now let's start moving into what are the changes. I'm going to look at these three changes in today's presentation. Darren's going to do a good job diving into more of the longer list of significant changes that are going to be occurring moving from 2018 into 2021 IRC. But in today's presentation, we're going to dive not really deep into these three items, but they are of significant importance, I feel, that I want to make you aware of them and give a little bit of context as to what these changes are. So we're going to look at the energy code in Pennsylvania. We're going to look at continuous insulation and vapor retarders. I kept switching how I wanted to label that back and forth. I am going to touch on vapor retarders a little bit sooner in that section, and then kind of dive into how it relates to the continuous insulation portion of it. And then there are new testing procedures for air leakage, right? It's still a blower door test, but how it's calculated will be different. So I will look at a couple different situations or examples on how they're now calculated. So number one here is energy codes in Pennsylvania. We are currently, this is what where we're currently standing, right? The UCC Energy Code Summary. We have the 2018 Chapter 11. We have 2018 IECC, or the residential provisions out of the IECC with those RAC amendments. This is what that state or that climate zone looks like. Zooming in to Pennsylvania, we are under three climate zones: climate zone 6, 5, and 4, right? So the blue here is climate zone 6, the green is climate zone 5, and this yellow down here in the corner in the Philadelphia area, and I believe this is Lancaster County, York County. I'm sure somebody will let me know in the chat. Maybe York County. But either which way, you know where you are in those climate zones. They will be changing. Again, looking here at our insulation and fenestration table, we have these three different climate zones and where we currently stand. A couple of these will be the same, and some will be changing. Moving into the new code adoption process. So looking into 2021, we again have Chapter 11 out of the IRC. We have the residential provisions out of Chapter 4 in the IECC. We have the RAC amendments that change some of that, some of the language. It doesn't adopt everything. And then we have the Pennsylvania alternative. Yes, York County. Thank you very much, Sean. But what we're going to look at here today are these first three areas. We are not going to dive into the changes because we don't have them yet. We're currently under modeling process for the Pennsylvania alternative. So here we are looking at the 2021 climate zone map. This is of the country. And I'm sorry, it's not your eyes. This is blurry. This is the cleanest map I could find. But when zooming in, it does get a little bit blurry. And as you can see, Pennsylvania now only has two climate zones. So roughly 3/4 or 2/3 of the state of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is going to be under the new climate zone 5 area. And then roughly 1/4 or 1/3 of Pennsylvania is going to be under the new climate zone 4. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's interesting. So we're now removing climate zone 6. And I want to stop that right now, right? Because it's not, we're going from 3 climate zones to 2 climate zones, but I don't want to give false impressions by saying, yes, we are getting rid of climate zone 6, because when looking at the R values, it's more like, or more along the lines of removing climate zone 4-ish and then sliding or merging climate zone 6 with climate zone 5. So these are the new insulation and fenestration tables transitioning into the 2021 ICC codes with amendments, because it's also extremely important to know that these values as written here are not the same as they are written in the 2021 Chapter 11 out of the IRC, or the residential provisions out of Chapter 4 out of the IECC. This table was explicitly pulled from the RAC report. Again, you can look at the source here at the bottom. By clicking on that, it will also take you directly to the RAC report. This table is as shown here within that RAC report. So if you were hoping to be able to open the IRC and find what the R values are moving forward, they are going to be slightly different than what's being shown here. So to give a quick recap, we're looking at climate zone 4. Again, we're looking at that lower eastern, southeastern portion of Pennsylvania, and that is a cavity only of R20 or cavity 13 plus a continuous insulation of R5 on the exterior. There are two options for wood framed walls. Looking at the new remaining portion of Pennsylvania, which is roughly the remaining 3/4, we'll call it, is going to be R23 cavity only, which you can achieve by going with a mineral wool product, or going with, for a 2x4 construction, R13 cavity plus R7.5 continuous, or looking at a 2x4 construction will give you an R20 cavity plus an R3.8 continuous. I looked, I couldn't find a continuous insulation that met those R values. So if you want to run with the previous R13 plus 10 or 20 plus 5, we can go with that as well. Some of my examples a little bit later on do go with XPS product that is R5 per inch. So we're looking at a 1-inch R5 or a 2-inch R10. One other thing that I do, and we can switch to this next slide here, is looking at your slab R values and depth and going across. Hopefully my cursor does show up here. So we have our 2018 R values being shown on the left-hand side of this table, and then our 2021 R values shown on the right-hand side. Big shout out to Pam, our newest member of the PHRC, for pulling together this table for me. I really appreciate it. But I have two red outlined boxes here, which is the wood framed R values, which do change depending on your climate zone. And then additionally, our slab R values also change for climate zone 5. Again, keep in mind here that climate zone 5 is, again, I don't have the exact breakdown, but we're going to call it 3/4 of Pennsylvania. We now have to have R10 for 4 feet, and that can be a combination of both vertical and horizontal insulation underneath that slab, or R15 for 3 feet. So again, keep in mind that that did change along with the wood framed R values. The ceiling R values, again, the RAC did a good job at reviewing this. We do have R49 across both climate zones in Pennsylvania. That did not change. That R value is different if looking at the as written table in the IRC. So again, it's very, very important to know that this RAC report takes precedence over the written table in the IRC. This is I wanted to pull this in because there was a major provision in the written provisions in the 2021 IRC, and it has to do with the additional energy efficiency portion. This section was not adopted during the RAC process. So the RAC report, section N1101.13.5, additional energy efficiency was not adopted as part of the current Pennsylvania adoption of the 2021 IRC or IECC. And this really does tie into provision N1108.2, additional energy or additional efficiency package options. And there was a modification to this, right? So previously, this would be a strikeout in the RAC report that this section was not adopted. This provision here, talking about additional energy packages, was modified where it pulled out for compliance with N1101.13.5 was struck out because it was not adopted. So The point I want to get at here is if you're into the light reading of reading code language and reading the code book, when you're working through chapter 11 and you get to N1108.2, which talks about the additional efficiency package options, this language was not completely struck from the code and was taken from being a mandatory requirement to an optional requirement. So as you can see here, this is the language out of this middle portion here is the language out of the RAC report, striking out for compliance with section N1101.13.5, which then takes it from a mandatory requirement to being an optional. The context here is this modified language leaves the provisions in the code but are no longer mandatory. They can now be a guide for increased energy efficiency, right? So you can look at these additional efficiency package options and include some of these provisions to help increase energy efficiency, used as a guideline, not as a mandatory requirement. So what does this mean when looking at the energy code adoption? Moving forward, check your location for change in your climate zone. If you were in the middle of the state and you were previously climate zone 5, more than likely you're still going to be climate zone 5. However, there are some changes to your R values, right? You're going from, I don't think I touched very much on that. Let me jump back super quick. One of the biggest changes here, I did touch on this for climate zone 5, is either a cavity only R23 or going with 13 plus, we're going to call it 10, or 20 plus 5, which does require prescriptively exterior continuous insulation for roughly 3/4 of Pennsylvania. It's an important point that I would just like to hammer home. Continuous insulation may become more mainstream due to the prescriptive requirements. Again, 3/4 of Pennsylvania is now going to prescriptively require, if you're not going with an R23 cavity only, it's going to require prescriptively a cavity or a continuous insulation requirement. Look for new high density insulation that can meet the R23 cavity only requirement. Again, mineral wool does meet that for 2x4 construction. You can get an R23 cavity only. And Brian Keene just posted in the chat. We might be able to share that with everybody if you don't mind, Brian, a link to an R23 fiberglass option. Review slab insulation details for the potential of R10 for 4 foot or R15 for 3 feet. This might be an estimating or takeoff consideration, right? We want to make sure that moving forward, that doesn't get overlooked. It's not a large change. However, looking at if you're going from 2 feet to 4 feet, it is definitely going to be a takeoff consideration. Okay, jumping into vapor retarders and continuous insulation. The vapor retarder requirement or provision did change slightly. So I do want to make everybody aware of some of the nuances or some of the added changes, some of the additional tables that are now added to help along the process of choosing the most correct vapor retarder for your assembly. So here is the new language. If you look at the exceptions, basement walls is still there as an exception for a vapor retarder. I just want to throw that out there before we jump into the depths of a vapor retarder requirement. So looking at our first portion here, vapor retarder materials shall be classified in accordance with table 702.7 parenthesis 1. This is similar to what we've had previously when talking about our different classifications. I don't know if all of this information has been previously included in the code language, but it is nice that it now kind of gives our class 1, class 2, and class 3. It also now provides the perm rating, which classify within those different classes, which was not previously in the code. So this all-in-one table is definitely a good step in the right direction. Again, looking at class 1 being that the perm rating must be less than or equal to a 0.1 perm. Looking at a class 2, it has to fall within a 0.1 to 1 perm. And then jumping to a class 3, it must be 1 to 10 perm. Anything that's greater than 10 perm is vapor open and is not considered a vapor retarder. Vapor retarders shall be provided on the interior side of framed walls of the class indicated in 702.7 parenthesis 2. So here we are looking at, depending on what climate zone we're in, the required vapor retarder classification needed for the interior side of that framed wall. The one that I want to jump to here first is climate zone 5, and that has either a class 1 or class 2 vapor retarder needed for climate zone 5. If you remember the previous iteration, it also said that for both climate zones 5 and 6, you had to have a class 1 vapor retarder. But I want to jump to when it's calling out for a class 1 for climate zone 5, that we have a footnote B. And footnote B says that where the use of class 1 interior vapor retarder in a framed wall with a class 1 vapor retarder on the exterior shall require an approved design. Looking at this slide here, if you've attended any of our control layer sessions or the 4Ds of moisture management, you've seen this slide before, and this was an approved design that carried with it significant risk, right? This looks at a 6.5, an R6.5 polyiso foil-faced rigid foam, which is a class 1 vapor retarder, vapor barrier. And then we have a fiberglass insulation with a 4 mil poly on the interior. 4 mil poly is also a class 1 vapor retarder or vapor barrier. Previously, or in currently, the 2018, this is a code approved design, which again does carry with it some significant risk with class 1 vapor retarders on both the interior and exterior. Again, jumping back to this table with footnote B, the use of a class 1 in the interior and a class 1 in the exterior now requires an approved design. So at least now the code is taking reference to that design and requiring an approved design. So they're really kind of pushing you to using, for climate zone 5, a class 2 vapor retarder on the inside as opposed to a class 1, which is, again, a step in the right direction here. The other thing I want to point out here is that climate zone 4, you can have a class 2 or class 3 are both permitted within this table. So the last two tables that we're going to look at, again, we now know that looking at jumping back here, looking at this table, we know what vapor retarders are, what their classifications are. This next table now says, okay, now that you know what the classifications are and what type of materials what type of materials are included in each classification, these are the climate zones in which you have to apply those vapor retarders. It now allows us to take a look at including the compliance for table R702.7 parenthesis 3 and parenthesis 4 where applicable, because it's important to know where applicable here. This is 702.7 parenthesis 3, and looking at reducing the prescribed class 1 or class 2 vapor retarder for climate zone 5 to now having the option of introducing a class 3 vapor retarder for climate zone 5 in regard to using continuous insulation. So this code process, or this table, says that for in climate zone 5, you can go from a class 1 or class 2 vapor retarder to a class 3, provided that you have continuous insulation with R value greater than or equal to R5 for a 2x4 wall, or greater than or equal to 7.5 for a 2x6 wall. Right below here, I have our insulation and fenestration table for climate zone 5, and for a 2x4 wall, we are at 7.5, so we can, but however, not however, but for climate zone 5 for 2x4 wall, we meet that with our prescriptive continuous R value. Where we might have a slight concern is for our 2x6 wall needing a greater than or equal to 7.5, where prescriptively we only have a 3.8. So to reduce our 2x6 framed wall with continuous insulation, we'd have to increase it from 3.8 to 7.5 to be able to reduce our vapor retardant from a 1 or 2 to a class 3. It's just something that we definitely want to keep in mind. We had that slight disconnect in 2018 that does carry forward into the 2021 IRC, but the disconnect is slightly smaller. In 2018, it had to be 11.25, so now it has to be a 7.5 or probably a 2-inch foam. R10 for 2x6 wall. To again have that reduction to a class 3 vapor retarder. This last one here, remember it says as applicable. This table here is probably not going to be as applicable for most situations. This talks about the continuous insulation with a class 2 vapor retarder when installing continuous insulation, not necessarily for the need of the prescriptive value, but really for moisture control. If you look at footnote A here, it says that the requirement of this table apply only to insulation used to control moisture in order to permit the use of a class 2 vapor retarder. This insulation material used to satisfy this option is also contribute but does not supersede the thermal envelope requirement. But again, if we want to look at the R values, we do comply here. This is for 4, 5, and 6, where we have to have greater than R3 over a 2x4 wall. If we jump to climate zone 5, a 2x4 wall is already requiring a 7.5, so we exceed this, and a 2x6 wall says a greater than or equal to R5 for a 2x6 wall. I don't know if you're going to find an R3.8. It's probably going to be an R5 anyway. So again, we do meet the intent. But again, it's not to supersede the required R value. It's really just for choosing a continuous insulation to combat or control moisture. Okay, so now I want to look at a couple examples here. Here we have a standard wall, 2x6 wall that does not have any exterior insulation, but really what I want to look at here is what's our moisture drive or what's our vapor drive in the winter, because that's where you're going to have the most concern for any sort of condensation happening. So our drive is going to be from the interior out, right? Or yes, from the interior out. It's going to go from a high concentration of heat to a lower concentration of heat, which again is going to move from interior out. Looking at our prescriptive R values for climate zone 4, again, is R20 or 13 plus 5. And then here in climate zone 5 is a cavity only R23 or 13 plus 7.5 or 13 plus 10, and R20 plus 3.8 or 5. But the code does allow you to go down to, the amended code does allow you to go down to the written values as shown here in the table. So looking at a 2x6 wall, here we have our 20 plus 3.8 or our 20 plus 5. Our moisture drive is again going to be from the interior out. Does this assembly allow for drying? I would say it does. A 1-inch rigid XPS is roughly a 1.5 perm. Again, looking at the table that we just saw for vapor retarders in the new code, and this would be a 1.5 perm, falls between 1 and 10. Therefore, it is a class 3 vapor retarder. The craft face bat insulation is the craft facing is a vapor retarder of 1 perm, so it's a class 2. House wrap is vapor open for the most part. Is this good? I would say yes. Our throttle in this case, or what is our most limiting factor for vapor transmission? That would be the class 2 vapor retarder or class 2 craft facing. And this is indeed 100% code compliant. Jumping to a 2x4 wall with 2-inch R10 XPS on the exterior. Again, our vapor drive is still going to be from the interior out. We have a 2-inch R10, which is a 0.7 perm. This is a class 2 vapor retarder. Again, anything from 0.1 and 1 is a class 2 vapor retarder. It is a friction fit bad insulation. This does meet the intent of going to a class 3 vapor retarder. So our latex paint is 6 perm, which is a class 3. Looking here again, is this good? I would say yes. This assembly is allowed to dry both interior and exterior. The throttle, again, or our most limiting factor for vapor transmission is our 2-inch R10 rigid foam, which is a class 2. Rule of thumb here, again, this is a rule of thumb, is that whenever you have a wall assembly that has exterior continuous rigid insulation, 1/3 of that R value, total assembly R value, should be included in that continuous layer. This wall assembly here, 1/3 of the total wall assembly is 7.6, and we have more than 1/3 of that on the outside. That definitely helps reduce the risk of condensation, right? So that 1/3 rule of thumb, I want to make sure that everyone understands that this is rule of thumb only. 1/3 of that on the exterior does dramatically decrease the risk of condensation. Okay, jumping to our last portion here. Boy, 2 minutes left. Rachel, you win on that one. I did not finish on time. Looking at the blower door testing requirements, and a quick recap as to where we are today in the 2018, and it states that the building or dwelling shall be tested and verified of having an air leakage rate of not exceeding 3 air changes per hour in climate zones 3 through 8. Again, Pennsylvania in 2018 is in climate zones 4, 5, and 6, so it's not less or not greater than or shall not exceed 3 air changes per hour. Here's a quick depiction of what the blower door looks like, right? We put the blower door assembly in a centrally located door. We are depressurizing the structure to a rate or to a point of roughly 50 pascals or negative 50 pascals, and that introduces or simulates roughly 20-mile-per-hour wind hitting all sides of this structure. And what you're doing is at 50 pascals, you're reading the amount of air exhausting through that fan, and that's your CFM 50, and then you input that information into a calculation. Yeah, did the last slide say 5 air changes per hour, not 3? And so it does say 5 air changes per hour, but it's for climate zones 1 and 2, right? Pennsylvania is in 4, 5, and 6. That's why I jumped to the red. Shall not exceed 3 air changes per hour for the Pennsylvania or the climate zones located within Pennsylvania. So blower door testing in the 2021 IRC, right? This language did change. So the building or dwelling unit shall be tested for air leakage. The maximum air leakage rate for any building or dwelling unit under any compliance path shall not exceed 5 air changes per hour or 0.28 cubic feet per minute per square foot of dwelling unit enclosure. There's a whole lot to unpack in that area there. The first thing I'm just going to touch on that I'm not going to dive deep into because there's a lot of additional requirements is the 5 air changes per hour. If you are running a prescriptive performance path or prescriptive energy compliance path, that then changes to 3 for the climate zones in Pennsylvania. When getting further into this, you can jump to 5 air changes per hour. However, it's a trade-off within performance compliance paths. So we're not going to touch on that. What we're really going to touch on here is the or 0.28 cubic feet per minute per square foot of a dwelling unit enclosure area. This is important to know, the dwelling unit enclosure area, because this is a new term applied to the 2021 IRC. And it is defined, thank goodness, and dwelling unit enclosure area is defined as the sum of the area of the ceiling, floors, and walls separating a dwelling unit's conditioned space from the exterior or from adjacent conditioned or unconditioned spaces. The wall height shall be measured from the finished floor of the dwelling unit to the underside of the floor above. I did give a webinar about a month and a half ago, whatever it was, on the air tightness or for attached dwelling units. And I kind of went through this definition there, but I did want to clarify when it talks about the second portion here, wall height shall be measured from the finished floor of the dwelling unit to the underside of the floor above. This is what we're looking at here. So we're going finished floor to the underside of the floor above, and then finished floor to the underside of floor above, finished floor to the ceiling. I wanted to have some clarification there for that. I'm going to look at two examples. One is going to be a detached unit and one's going to be an attached unit. So the first one here is a single family detached. The specifications for this example is a 1,897 square foot finished area, and it's also, because it's a conditioned basement, it's a 2,758 square foot of conditioned area. The ceiling heights are 8 feet for all three: basement, first floor, and second floor. This is the layout of my example, right? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I just wanted to show it is, for the most part, it's going to be a box of a house here. So under the 2018 testing provisions, we have 6,888 cubic feet for the basement, 7,546 cubic feet for the first floor, 7,616 cubic feet for the second floor, which gives us a grand total of 22,050 cubic feet. We plug this into our calculation over here, right? So this 1,425, that's our cubic feet per minute through the fan. This is the number that I chose to get a certain result over here. We're just going to assume that we tested it and that's what we got. So it's cubic feet per minute times 60, because we're looking for air changes per hour, divided by the total volume of our house, which is 22,050 cubic feet. And that gives us a 3.8 ACH 50. This would not pass under the 2018. Remember, 2018 provisions state that within the climate zones within Pennsylvania, you have to be less than or equal to 3 ACH 50. This would not pass. Now let's look at that same house, right? We still have 1,425 CFM through the fan, but now we're looking at the 2021 testing provisions. So instead of the volume, we're looking at square foot of dwelling unit enclosure area. So our basement is 2013. Our first floor is 1,152, and then our second floor is 1,940. These numbers, just to bring sense to it, remember the basement has to look at not only the walls, but it's also looking at the basement floor, because that basement floor is separating conditioned from unconditioned space. The second floor is also looking at the walls, but it's also taking into account the ceiling. So that's why those numbers are larger than the first floor. This gives us a total of 5,109 square feet of dwelling unit enclosure area. If you want to plug that into the calculation, this now comes out to 0.278 CFM 50 per square foot. This would pass. Again, the only thing that changed here is how the test was given, and looking at square footage of dwelling unit enclosure area as opposed to the volume. So this goes from failing in the 2018 to passing in the 2021 provisions. Now looking at a quick exception, and this exception says that when testing individual dwelling units, an air leakage rate not exceeding 0.3 cubic feet per minute per square foot shall be permitted in all climate zones for attached single and multifamily dwelling units and buildings or dwelling units that are 1,500 square feet or smaller. So I want to break this down super quick here and say that the number one is, let's say a townhouse or a quad, whatever the case may be. This is attached single family dwelling units. And number two falls into play if we have a 1,200 square foot ranch. You can now use the number of 0.3 cubic feet per minute per square foot as opposed to 0.28. So the details of this example number two, is a single family attached unit with a square footage of 1,496 square feet or 2,041 conditioned square footage. And then our ceiling heights are as shown here at 9, 8, and 8. This is what the layout is. Again, this is a townhouse. We are now an attached unit. Looking at the 2018 testing provisions, again, due to the sake of time, I'm not going to run through all of these um, numbers here, but more importantly, I want to jump over here to say that we are at 4.9 ACH50. We are dramatically over the less than or equal to 3 ACH50 at 1,375 cubic feet per minute moving through that fan at 50 pascals. This would fail, right? One of the main areas of concern that we've heard over the past several years is that it's extremely difficult for small homes and attached homes to pass the 2018 blower door testing provisions. Looking at the 2021 testing provisions, again, I'm not going to run through these numbers again, but if you want to take a look at them, feel free to take a look at them. But this gives us 4,738 square feet of dwelling unit enclosure area. And you use the same cubic feet per minute at 50 pascals coming through the fan of 1,375. That gives us a 0.29 CFM50 per square foot. That passes. Again, looking back at the 2018 testing provisions, we come up with a 4.9 ACH50. This fails. Looking at the 2021 testing provision, this now passes with a 0.29, and it has to be a 0.30. So there's a pretty significant change here that allows for folks to now have a larger probability of passing blower door tests for the attached dwelling units and for the smaller square footage detached units. Okay, so where do I go for more information? I showed this slide earlier on, but again, please feel free to use your phone to take this QR code to take you to the RAC report. This allows you to also go to the 2021 IRC and IECC.